In March of 2009, a grieving mother finally summoned the courage to step into her 17-year-old daughter's untouched bedroom. It had been 3 agonizing months since the teen ended her life. She braced herself for the heartbreak of old-school papers, fading makeup, and clothes still clinging to her scent. What she didn't expect was a hidden camera tucked behind the mirror. Still on, still recording. What that footage revealed would unravel everything she thought she knew about her daughter's final days, and expose the devastating truth about the man she thought she could trust. The cardboard boxes had been sitting quietly in the upstairs hallway for almost 2 full weeks, untouched and undisturbed. They were stacked neatly, like silent sentinels guarding the closed door at the end of the hall. Patty had picked them up from Dollar General on a gray Thursday, her fingers trembling as she placed them on the checkout counter. She had told the cashier they were for spring cleaning, those 2 hollow words rattling in her chest like loose marbles, because saying they were for packing up the remnants of her dead daughter's life was simply too much for her to speak aloud. In Ohio, March clung to winter's heels with a bitter tenacity. The skies were a dull, unbroken gray, and the wind cut through coats like it held a personal grudge. Everything felt harder in the cold. Breathing, moving, remembering. Especially remembering. The door to Chloe's room hadn't been opened since January, since the day they lost her. Dennis, her husband of 2 years, had gently offered to handle the task himself more than once. He had spoken with that careful, measured tone he always used when talking to her now, soft and steady, like she was a piece of antique glass with a long, visible crack. But this wasn't his burden to carry. Chloe hadn't been his daughter. At 2:17 p.m. on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, while Dennis was at work and the house stood still in its quiet grief, Patty finally turned the brass handle. The door creaked open like it, too, had been holding its breath. The scent hit her immediately. That unmistakable blend of vanilla body spray and lavender candle wax, the very essence of Chloe's presence, still lingered in the air. It clung to the fabric of the curtains, soaked into the sheets on the bed she hadn't been able to bring herself to strip. The room was frozen in time, a delicate museum of a life interrupted. A backpack lay slouched by the desk, jeans casually draped over the chair, and a half-empty water bottle sat untouched on the nightstand. Even the faint outline of lipstick on its rim remained, a soft, faded echo of a girl who used to laugh too loud and dream too big. Patty's breath hitched in her throat, her chest tightening with the weight of memory. She took one cautious step inside, then another. The first box came together easily. Into it went textbooks, notebooks, and the little collection of ceramic horses Chloe had once adored. Childhood relics, harmless, uncomplicated. The second box cut deeper. Hoodies that still smelled like her shampoo. A soft yellow sundress Chloe had picked out for homecoming but never got to wear. A pair of leggings she'd worn so often they practically molded to her shape. Each item folded with care, each crease a small funeral. By the time she reached the third box, the tears came, not in a flood, not in great shuddering sobs like at the funeral, but slow and relentless. A steady drip of sorrow that didn't scream but whispered, "She's really gone." Patty was folding a pair of jeans, her mind slipping through memories like worn photographs, when her elbow bumped the edge of the dresser mirror. It shifted, slightly askew. Frowning, she reached to adjust it, and her fingertips brushed something unexpected, something cold and hard taped to the back. Curious, she pulled the mirror gently away from the wall and turned it around. A small black rectangle was affixed to the rear panel with clear tape, barely noticeable. Wires, thin as strands of hair, snaked down toward a compact battery pack tucked behind the dresser. Her heart plummeted. It was a camera. Not the kind you'd find at an electronics store or hanging around someone's neck. This was discreet, designed to be hidden, the sort of thing you might expect in a thriller or spy film. But this was no movie. This was her daughter's bedroom. Her hands trembled as she peeled the device away from the mirror. It was warm, Not hot, but unmistakably warm, like it had been on for hours. A tiny red light blinked near the lens, still pulsing, still recording. Her stomach turned. Who would put a camera in Chloe's room? How long had it been there? And why hadn't she ever noticed? The thoughts came too fast to keep up with, crashing over one another in rapid succession, a tidal wave of questions with no answers. She turned the device over in her palm. No logo, no brand, just a micro SD card and a USB port. It looked more like a piece of evidence than technology. She clutched the camera in her fist until the sharp plastic edges bit into her skin. Her breathing had quickened, her mind racing toward terrible places. But there was no time to freeze. Her laptop was downstairs, still sitting where she'd left it on the kitchen counter. Dennis wouldn't be home for another 3 hours. With her free hand, she pulled Chloe's bedroom door shut behind her, sealing the silence in once again. Downstairs, the laptop took what felt like an eternity to boot. Or maybe it was just her body, adrift in dread, struggling to function. She sat at the kitchen table, the camera lying next to her coffee mug like a grotesque centerpiece. The red light had stopped blinking when she'd removed the battery, but in her mind, she could still feel it watching her, watching everything. Outside, wind clawed at the windows with long, moaning fingers. The house was too quiet, unnaturally so, as though even the walls were holding their breath. She slid the SD card into the laptop's port, her fingers hesitating above the trackpad. A part of her didn't want to know. What if the truth was worse than anything she could imagine? What if not knowing was the only kindness left to her? But Chloe had deserved more than a mother who turned away. She deserved the truth. The card held 847 video files, each named by date. The oldest one was from November 2008. That meant someone had been watching Chloe for over 4 months before she died. Patty's mouth went dry. Her pulse roared in her ears. She clicked on the most recent file, dated January 15th, just 3 days before the suicide. The screen filled with a static wide-angle view from the mirror's perspective. The bedroom, Chloe's safe space, everything in view. The bed, the desk, the pale blue curtains filtering afternoon sun. At 4:23 p.m., Chloe entered the frame. Her backpack drooped from her shoulder, her movements slow, dragging. Patty felt her chest clench as she watched her daughter drop the bag and sink onto the bed, head cradled in her hands. She looked empty, not tired, not sad, hollow, as though someone had scooped out everything that made her Chloe and left only a shell. And then, footsteps, heavy, slow, boots on the stairs, coming closer. Dennis appeared in the doorway like he owned the space, like it was his right to be there. He hadn't even changed out of his work clothes yet, still in the dark jeans and that light blue button-down he always said made him look sharp for clients. "Hey, kiddo," he said casually, his voice warm, the kind of tone designed to lower defenses. It was almost fatherly, almost. Chloe didn't move. She sat on the edge of the bed, her shoulders drawn tight, every muscle locked in place like she was bracing for a storm. She didn't lift her head, didn't return the greeting. Dennis walked into the room with slow, deliberate steps, the door clicking shut behind him with a softness that made it worse somehow, like secrecy itself. "How was school?" he asked, still in that light tone, still wearing the mask of concern. "Fine," Chloe mumbled without emotion. Dennis sat beside her on the bed, just a little too close. Patty could see it clearly on the video. How his knee brushed hers, how his arm hovered near her shoulder until it made contact. His hand landed there gently, but it stayed too long. Chloe didn't flinch, but her whole body seemed to pull inward. "You know you can talk to me, right?" he said, rubbing slow, circular patterns along her shoulder blade. "About anything." It was a statement disguised as comfort, but even through the screen, Patty could feel the undertone, something dark curling beneath the surface. Chloe inched away from his hand. "I'm fine, Dennis," she said again, a little firmer now, but her voice was tight, controlled, like she was walking a wire. "She's just been moody lately," Patty remembered Dennis saying that week. "Normal teenage stuff. They get quiet, secretive. It's a phase." He had sounded so understanding, so reassuring. And she'd believed him. "Your mom worries about you," Dennis continued on the recording, unfazed by Chloe's retreat. "And so do I. You've been so quiet lately. We just want to help." He shifted slightly, angling toward her, keeping his hand on her back like an anchor. His voice dropped to a near whisper. "I know it's hard, having someone new in the house, but I care about you, Chloe, more than you realize." That's when Chloe stood up, quick, abrupt. Her movements were sharp, cutting off his words. "I have homework," she said, her tone clipped. Her eyes avoided the camera. Her body language screamed for space. Dennis looked up at her and smiled, but there was something behind it now. Something chilling. "Of course you do," he said. "You're such a good student, so focused, so attentive." The way he drew out that last word made Patty's skin crawl. "I should let you work," Dennis added, rising slowly to his feet. He walked to the door but paused just before leaving. "But, Chloe," she glanced back at him, clearly reluctant. "Remember what we talked about, okay? About keeping family business private. Your mom has enough on her plate. Stress at work, bills. Life's hard enough without worrying about little things." Chloe nodded once, quick and mechanical. "Good girl," he said, then slipped out the door, closing it gently behind him. Chloe didn't move for a full minute, just stood there, frozen in place. Then, with slow movements, she walked to her desk, pulled a notebook from the drawer, and began to write. The camera's angle didn't catch what she wrote, but Patty could see the intensity in her daughter's face. Focused, determined. When she finished, she tore the page out, folded it into a tight square, and slipped it under her mattress. The video ended. Patty sat at the kitchen table, stunned, her hands gripping the edges hard enough to make her knuckles white. Her coffee had gone cold long ago. That interaction hadn't been innocent, and it hadn't been the only one. She clicked another video file, then another, and another after that. 17 videos in total. 17 conversations with the same pattern. Dennis is pushing boundaries, Chloe retreating. And every single time, he ended with a reminder not to tell her mother, not to stress her out, not to burden her with unnecessary worry. By the time Patty heard the familiar crunch of gravel under Dennis's truck tires outside, she felt sick. Her stomach roiled, her body shaking with a mixture of horror and fury. She pulled the SD card from the laptop, tucked it into the small zippered pocket of her jeans, and shut the lid. By the time Dennis walked through the front door at 6:30 p.m., she was standing at the stove, stirring a pot of marinara sauce, pretending like her world hadn't just collapsed. "Hey, honey," he said as he leaned in to kiss her cheek. "How was your day?" Patty forced a smile, lips barely moving. "Fine, just fine." But her hand never left her pocket. Her fingers wrapped tightly around the SD card that now felt like both a weapon and a confession. For the first time since Chloe's death, a terrifying new thought planted itself in her mind. What if Chloe's death hadn't been a choice? What if it had been engineered, manipulated by someone who wanted her silence? That night, sleep was impossible. She lay beside Dennis in the dark, the SD card now hidden in her jewelry box beneath old brooches and broken earrings. She listened to the sound of his breathing. Steady, even. She stared at the ceiling and counted the seconds between each inhale. Her mind replayed every sickening moment from the videos. Had those hands, the ones that now rested calmly under the comforter, touched her daughter? Had that voice, the one that whispered sweet things to her in bed, threatened Chloe behind closed doors? At 3:17 a.m., she couldn't take it anymore. She climbed out of bed silently, careful not to disturb the mattress. The third step from the top creaked, so she avoided it, stepping over it like she had 1,000 times before when Chloe was a baby. In the kitchen, Dennis's laptop sat open on the counter, the screen dark but humming softly. He never let her touch it. Said it was for work only. She powered it up. She needed to know what else was hidden, what else he might have been doing. But first, she needed to find that note Chloe had hidden. She crept back upstairs, her footsteps silent. The boxes from yesterday still lined the hallway like gravestones. Chloe's door was shut. She eased it open and stepped inside. The mattress was heavier than she'd expected. It took effort to lift one corner. Her fingers searched the shadows underneath. At first, there was nothing. Then, paper, not just one sheet. A bundle, held together by a stretched-out rubber band. Her hands shook as she pulled the stack out and stepped into the light of the hallway. Even with just the faint glow from the bathroom nightlight, she could make out Chloe's handwriting. Neat at first, but then it grew jagged, erratic. The first page was dated November 3rd, 2008. Dennis keeps coming into my room when Mom's at work. Says he's just checking in, but he stays too long. Sits on the bed, asks me weird stuff, if I've ever kissed anyone. I don't like it, but maybe I'm overreacting. Mom likes him? Patty turned the page. November 15th. He touched my shoulder today while I was studying. Just left his hand there. When I moved, he laughed and said I was jumpy. Said I reminded him of Mom when she was younger. I wanted to throw up. Another page. December 2nd. I caught him going through my dresser. Said he was helping Mom with laundry. But things had moved, and some of my underwear is gone. When I said something, he got mad. Told me I was being paranoid. That I should be grateful he cares. Patty's hands were shaking so hard the paper fluttered like wings. December 18th. He knows I'm suspicious, keeps bringing up how fragile Mom is, says that if I upset her again she might not recover. Said some secrets should stay buried. January 5th. She turned the page. Tell him you don't need any visitors today. Dennis's voice sliced through the quiet like a blade. He stood rigid in the doorway, a phone in his hand, screen lit and glowing in the dim light of the hallway. Outside, the wind rattled the bare branches of the maple tree near the porch, shadows twisting across the windows like grasping fingers. He extended the phone toward Patty, not moving from his place. Text him, he said again. His tone was flat, but his eyes were tight, watching her every breath. Now, Patty hesitated. The morning's weight still clung to her chest, her hands trembling slightly from adrenaline, her throat still sore. She took the phone with a shaky hand, the glass screen warm against her palm. Her thumb hovered above the keyboard. Her thoughts raced. I'm okay, just having a hard morning cleaning out Chloe's room. She stared at the message, stomach turning. The words looked wrong. They felt like lies. Her finger didn't move. Send it, Dennis said, more forceful now. The edge in his voice had sharpened. Instead, she hit backspace. Her heart pounded as she typed quickly, fingers flying before courage could vanish. Need help. Come now. Emergency. She pressed send. The moment the message disappeared from the screen, Dennis's hand lunged. He snatched the phone from her grip with terrifying speed. His eyes scanned the message. A beat passed, just one, but it was enough for his entire face to change. You stupid bitch, he growled. The mask dropped in an instant. Gone was the soft-spoken, patient husband. Standing in front of her now was the man Chloe must have seen in her last hours, a predator unmasked. David lives 20 minutes away, Dennis said, his voice thick with menace as he stepped toward her. That gives me plenty of time to clean this up. Patty's heart seized. She turned to run, feet scrambling toward the bedroom door. But Dennis moved fast, too fast. His hand latched onto her arm, jerking her backward. She stumbled, crashing into the edge of Chloe's old dresser. A perfume bottle shattered beneath her elbow, and pieces of jewelry scattered like marbles across the floor. You want to know what really happened to your daughter? He hissed, pressing her against the wall. The pressure of his body was overwhelming, violent. She came home early that day. I found myself going through her stuff. She flipped out. Started yelling about cameras and photos. Said she was going to tell you everything. His hand closed around Patty's throat. Her breath caught instantly, the world narrowing to a pinpoint. So, he whispered, lips inches from her face. I helped her understand that some secrets are worth dying for. Patty clawed at his wrists, her fingers scraping uselessly at his skin. Her lungs screamed. Black spots crept into the corners of her vision. Somewhere in the background, a clock ticked on the nightstand, an eerie metronome counting down the seconds of her life. The pills were easy, Dennis murmured, like he was telling a bedtime story. Crushed them into her soda. She was out cold within minutes. The note? He smiled. Even easier. I'd been watching her type homework for months. I knew every phrase she used, every mistake she always made. I copied her tone perfectly. Patty's phone buzzed from where it had fallen. Once, twice, 3 times. The sound was muffled but distinct. Dennis froze. That'll be David, he said, his grip tightening. Coming to play the hero, he sneered. Voice a low, mocking drawl. Too bad he's about to find out both his sister and his niece couldn't handle their grief. He squeezed harder. Patty's vision blurred into darkness. But then, outside, a rumble. Tires on gravel. A truck door slammed shut with a crack like thunder. Dennis's hands loosened. Just enough. Patty gasped, air slicing into her chest. The pain was instant, raw, her throat burning. Her knees buckled, but she held herself upright, barely. Dennis turned toward the window, calculating. Shit. Footsteps echoed on the porch below. David's voice, loud, urgent, boomed through the house. Patty, you okay? Your text scared the hell out of me. The jingle of keys followed. Dennis's head snapped toward the bedroom door. His eyes were wild now, darting between her and the hallway like a trapped animal. Then he composed himself, and that sick, practiced smile crept back across his face. Here's what's going to happen, he said, stepping in close again. You're going to tell your brother everything's fine, that you were upset, that you texted him by mistake. The front door creaked open below. Heavy work boots clunked across the hardwood. Patty? David's voice was closer now. Where are you? Dennis grabbed Patty's chin roughly, forced her to meet his eyes. One wrong word, one little hint, and David joins Chloe. Understand? He leaned in. I'll make it look like a murder-suicide. The grieving brother couldn't handle it anymore, killed his sister, then himself. Real tragic. Patty stared at him, horror rooted deep in her gut. He wasn't bluffing. He had done it once. He'd do it again. And then, Dennis added, tone almost dreamy. Poor widower Dennis gets to start over. Maybe they will move to another town, finds another woman, maybe one with a daughter who trusts him. Patty. David's voice was at the top of the stairs now. Dennis released her and stepped back. In the room's dim light, he transformed once again into the concerned husband. His eyes softened, his stance relaxed. To anyone else, he would have looked like he was comforting her. He whispered one last time, David's life depends on how good an actress you are. David stepped into the doorway a second later, breath visible in the chill air clinging to his sweatshirt. His face was flushed, eyes wide with concern. He scanned the room in a heartbeat. The scattered drawers, papers on the floor, his sister's red, bruised neck. Jesus, Patty, you look terrible, he said, stepping fully into the room. What's going on? You texted emergency. Patty opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her lips trembled. Her throat ached. Dennis slipped an arm around her waist, pulling her close like a doting spouse. She's just having a rough morning, he said smoothly. Went to clean out Chloe's room, brought up a lot. You know how it is. David's eyes narrowed. He wasn't buying it. His gaze dropped to Patty's neck. What happened to your throat? He asked. She had a panic attack, Dennis answered before she could speak. I was trying to calm her down, keep her from hyperventilating. You know how she gets sometimes. But David didn't look away. He stepped forward slowly, ignoring Dennis completely. "Patty," he said gently, "look at me." Her eyes met his. She could see the boy who used to walk her home from school, the man who helped her move when her divorce was finalized, the brother who had always believed her. Dennis's arm tightened, a threat in every finger. She started, voice barely audible. David waited, patient, just like when they were kids and she couldn't find the words. Behind him, Dennis's free hand inched toward his back pocket. Patty caught the glint of metal, a tool handle, maybe a screwdriver from the garage. David was unarmed. He didn't see it. She had to say something now, anything. "I'm scared," she whispered. Dennis's body tensed. Everything in him went still. Patty turned her eyes to David. "I found something," she said, louder now. "About Chloe, about what really happened." "Patty, don't," Dennis growled. But there was no kindness left in his tone. No disguise, just fury and fear and the edge of something desperate. Now it was no longer veiled tension. It was pure threat. David recognized it instantly. His body shifted into a fighter's stance without thinking, feet shoulder-width apart, knees slightly bent, hands relaxed, ready. 20 years in construction had taught him to spot a man on the edge, and Dennis had that look, the coiled posture of someone about to pounce. "What did you find?" David asked, his voice calm, his eyes locked on Dennis. There was no fear in his tone, only warning. Patty wrenched herself from Dennis's grip, her breath ragged. Her legs trembled beneath her, but didn't give out. She steadied herself, standing tall despite the bruises blooming across her neck. Her eyes burned with truth and fury. "She didn't kill herself," she said. "He murdered her." Dennis's hand shot to his back pocket, but David was already moving. In one explosive burst, he closed the distance, ramming his shoulder into Dennis's chest. The force sent Dennis crashing into the wall, his head thudding against the plaster. A small blade, box cutter, orange-handled, flew from Dennis's hand, skittering across the hardwood floor. They hit the ground hard. The impact shook the room. David landed on top of Dennis, knees pinning his arms, weight crushing him into the boards. But Dennis fought like a man with nothing left to lose, like a cornered animal. He thrashed wildly, clawing at David's face, his fingers scraping toward eyes and soft skin. One knee drove up, aiming for ribs. "Patty!" David grunted, blocking a wild swing. "Get out! Call the cops!" But she didn't move. She couldn't, not yet. Her eyes darted to the floor where Chloe's torn journal pages lay scattered like fallen leaves. Proof. Her daughter's truth. With trembling hands, she dropped to her knees and began gathering them one by one, fingers curling around each piece of her daughter's voice. Across the floor, Dennis twisted violently, managing to roll halfway out from under David's weight. He scrambled toward the box cutter. The blade glinted in the sunlight pouring through the bedroom window. His fingertips brushed it. David lunged again, grabbing Dennis by the ankle and yanking him back hard. "You don't understand," Dennis panted, writhing in his grip. "She was going to ruin everything. That girl was poison." David's fist answered for him. The sound echoed, raw, final, bone against bone. "She was 17, David snarled, panting, adrenaline pounding in his ears. Dennis turned, blood in his teeth. "She was a little bitch who didn't know how to shut up." David hit him again, and again. Across the room, Patty found her phone buried beneath a pile of overturned laundry. Her hands trembled as she dialed. The screen blurred beneath her tears, but she tapped 3 digits. Pressed call. 911, what's your emergency? "My husband killed my daughter," she said. Her voice was clear, steady, firmer than it had been in months. "And I have proof." On the floor, Dennis had stopped fighting. He lay bruised, blood trickling from his nose, lips split, his breathing shallow. But his eyes were still alert, still dangerous, calculating. "You'll never prove it," he rasped, spitting blood to the side. "It's just the word of a dead girl and her crazy mother." Patty stepped closer, her phone glowing in her hand. She looked down at him, not with fear, but with clarity. "I don't need to prove it," she said quietly. She held up the screen. The voice recorder app had been running the entire time. Dennis's face shifted, the blood draining from what little color he had left. In his mind, she could see it, playing back everything he'd said. The threats, the murder, the confession. All of it. David stood, fists bloodied, chest heaving. He glanced at the phone and then at Dennis, his lip curling into a grim smile. Looks like Chloe gets the last word after all. The wail of sirens arrived first, then flashing lights through the living room windows. The paramedics came in first, then officers, and finally Detective Martinez, mid-40s, short-cropped hair, and a notepad already open by the time she crossed the threshold. Her eyes were tired but sharp, the eyes of someone who'd walked into too many living rooms after the screams had stopped. Dennis sat in the back of a patrol car, wrists cuffed, lip cleaned up, and arrogance still intact. Even behind glass, Patty could see his mouth moving, already on the phone with a lawyer, already spinning his narrative. Another grieving family. Another breakdown. Another unhinged widow. But Patty had the recording. She had the journal. She had the truth. Detective Martinez joined them at the kitchen table. The same table where, hours ago, Patty had first seen the horrors hiding in the videos. David stood behind her, one firm hand on her shoulder, solid and grounding. "I need you to walk me through everything," Martinez said gently. Patty nodded. Her throat ached, the bruises already setting in, but her voice held steady as she walked through it all. The hidden camera, the videos, the journal entries. "He made her feel crazy," she said, fingers brushing her throat. "He convinced her she was imagining it, that she was the problem, just like he did to me." Martinez scribbled in her notepad. "Classic predator behavior, isolation, manipulation, gaslighting, threats against family. It's textbook." Then came the question Patty had been dreading. "Mrs. Reynolds, did you suspect anything before today?" It hung in the air like smoke. Patty's voice cracked. "I thought she was just being a teenager, moody, distant. Dennis said it was normal, that she'd come around." She wiped at her eyes. "And I wanted to believe him. Because it was easier than accepting that I'd brought a monster into our home." David's hand squeezed her shoulder again. "You couldn't have known." "I should have," Patty whispered. "I was her mother." Tears streamed down her face now. "I was supposed to protect her." Martinez leaned forward. "Your daughter spent months protecting you. She knew you loved Dennis. She knew telling you would tear your life apart. So she chose to bear it, alone, to protect you." The words landed like a punch. Patty folded forward, shoulders shaking, sobs pouring out from a place too deep to name. "That recording you made," Martinez said softly, "and Chloe's journal. They'll put him away for life. Her death won't be ruled a suicide. It'll be labeled what it was, murder." Outside, more police vehicles pulled up. Crime scene techs entered with cameras and plastic bins. They moved through the house cataloging tragedy, turning Chloe's memory into evidence. Martinez's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and frowned. "What is it?" David asked. "He's claiming self-defense," Martinez said, voice flat. "He says he found Patty mid-psychotic episode in her daughter's room. Claims David attacked him without warning." Patty's heart sank. The chill returned. "He says the recording's out of context," Martinez added. "He says he was trying to calm her down, that she's delusional." Patty's mouth went dry. "Will that work?" "Not a chance," Martinez said, eyes hard. "We found the camera. The SD card alone shows hours of abuse. And that journal." She shook her head. "Your daughter documented it all. Dates, incidents, behavior changes. It reads like a training manual on predatory grooming." Just then, a crime scene tech stepped into the kitchen. "Detective, You're going to want to see this." They followed him upstairs to Dennis's home office. Normally locked, the door now open. Patty had never spent more than a minute inside. He'd always said it was private, work stuff, sensitive files. The tech pointed at the monitor. The screen displayed an open folder. Dozens of image files. The password? Chloe123, the tech said grimly. "We found over 300 photos and videos," the tech said, his voice flat but tinged with horror. "Not just of the victim, of other girls too. Dozens, maybe more. Some of them appear to be taken through windows, changing rooms and public restrooms, all without consent." The words hung in the air like a poisonous fog. Patty's knees buckled. For a moment, the world tilted. She would have hit the floor if David hadn't stepped forward, catching her just in time. He held her upright, one arm firm around her waist, the other bracing her shoulder. "There's more," the technician continued reluctantly. "Chat logs, conversations with other known predators. They shared grooming techniques, victim profiles, detailed discussions." He hesitated, glancing toward the hallway where officers still moved in and out of Dennis's office like bees swarming a hive. "And there are notes, plans for after Chloe." Patty's breath caught. Her heart thudded loudly in her ears. "He was already researching single mothers in nearby towns," the tech added. "He had spreadsheets, names, public social media profiles, notes about their daughters, ages, schools, hobbies." Detective Martinez cursed under her breath, a sharp exhale of disgust. "Chloe wasn't his first," she said, "and she wasn't going to be his last." Patty stared at the open folder on the screen. Hundreds of files, images frozen in time, each one a silent scream. Her stomach churned. Every photo was a crack in the illusion she'd lived in for 2 years. Every file is a reminder that the man she'd shared her bed with was not merely broken. He was engineered to deceive, to hunt. "How many girls?" she whispered. "We're still going through everything," Martinez replied, her tone softer now. "But Mrs. Reynolds, your daughter may have saved more lives than just yours. By documenting what she went through, by triggering Dennis before he was ready, she exposed the entire framework of his operation." They moved Patty to the living room, away from the evidence, away from the images that were already seared into her memory. She sat numbly on the couch, the same couch where she and Dennis had shared takeout, where they'd watched movies and held hands. David sat beside her, silent but present. He brought her water, tissues, and a blanket. Every time she shivered or gasped, he was there, grounding her. By evening, the house was quiet again. The techs had finished cataloging the computer, bagging hard drives, and photographing everything. Officers had taken statements. The chaos had passed, but what remained was worse. Stillness. The hum of the refrigerator. The faint ticking of the wall clock. Her mind was spinning in that silence. "I have to sell this house," she said, breaking the stillness. David looked at her. "You don't have to decide that now." "Yes," she said firmly. "I do." She looked around the living room, this place that had once felt warm, safe. Now every photo frame was a betrayal. Every wall, every floorboard is contaminated. "This house is a lie," she said. "Every room is a lie, every memory." David nodded slowly. "Where will you go?" Patty was quiet for a long time. Then she spoke. "I want to see the journal again. All of it. I want to read every word Chloe wrote. She was trying to tell me something, David. She left me clues, and I ignored them." She turned to her brother, eyes bloodshot but resolute. "I can't bring her back, but I can make sure she's heard. I can help other mothers recognize what I didn't." Detective Martinez had left her card on the table, along with pamphlets. Grief counseling, support groups, victim services. A list of numbers for the broken to call when they needed to feel human again. But first, Patty needed something else. She needed to go back to Chloe's room, not to pack, not to clean, not yet. She needed to say goodbye. The door to Chloe's bedroom creaked softly as she pushed it open. The air inside felt heavier now. Not like a shrine, not like the last time she'd entered. Now it felt like what it truly was, a crime scene finally acknowledged. The police tape was gone, but traces of their presence remained. Fingerprint powder coated the edges of the mirror. A small marker still sat near the corner where the camera had been found. Even the carpet showed faint indentations where their equipment had stood. She sat on the bed, the journal in her lap. It was thinner now, several pages removed for evidence, but still intact. The pages felt delicate beneath her fingertips, like leaves pressed between glass. "I'm sorry," she whispered into the stillness. "I'm so sorry. I didn't see what he was doing to you." David stood just outside the doorway, leaning on the frame. He didn't speak, but she could feel his presence. Steady, dependable. Patty opened the journal to a page she hadn't seen before. The date read December 24th. Christmas Eve. Mom made her famous sugar cookies today. Dennis kept helping her in the kitchen, kept brushing her waist, whispering jokes that made her laugh. She's so happy with him. Happier than I've seen her since Dad left. I can't take that from her, even if it destroys me. Patty's tears spilled freely. I used to think love meant protecting people from pain, but maybe it means carrying pain so they don't have to. Mom carried so much when Dad cheated. She doesn't need to carry this too. She was protecting me, Patty said aloud, voice breaking. She was protecting me, all the way to the end. Her phone buzzed in her lap. It was Detective Martinez. "Mrs. Reynolds," she said, "I have an update. Dennis's lawyer is pushing for a plea deal." Patty's hand clenched around the phone. "What kind of deal?" "Voluntary manslaughter, 25 to life. He's claiming he gave Chloe the pills to calm her down after she threatened to hurt herself. Says he never meant to kill her." "That's bullshit," Patty said through gritted teeth. "I know," Martinez replied. "We're not taking it. The evidence, the journal, the footage, your recording, all point to premeditation. We're going for life, no parole." When the call ended, Patty stared at her daughter's handwriting for a long while. 3 months ago, she'd thought her daughter was spiraling into typical teenage depression. Now she understood. Chloe had died trying to save her. David's phone buzzed on the nightstand. He glanced at the screen, his brow furrowing. "What is it?" Patty asked. He turned the phone toward her. It was a text message from an unknown number. "Your sister should have kept her mouth shut. Some secrets are better buried." Patty's blood ran cold. "Dennis?" "He's in jail," David said. "No phone access." But even as he said it, they both understood. Dennis hadn't been working alone. The chat logs, the network. There were others. "Call Martinez," Patty said, her voice clear. "We're not done." Before David could finish dialing, Patty's phone rang again, this time her own. The screen showed unknown number. Without thinking, driven by instinct more than reason, she answered. "Hello?" she said cautiously. Silence stretched on the line for half a second too long. Then a voice emerged. Male, older, smooth in that unnerving way. Southern accent, slight but deliberate. "Your daughter was a pretty little thing," he said softly. "Shame she had to be so stubborn." Patty's heart slammed against her ribs. Her fingers clenched around the phone. "Who is this?" she demanded. The voice remained calm, even pleasant. "A friend of Dennis's. He told us all about you, Patricia." Her blood froze. He was proud, really. Talked about your house, your little job at the bank, your morning routine, your grocery habits. Said you were the kind of woman who didn't ask too many questions. Said Chloe was a complication. In the living room, David had gone pale. He was already redialing 911, speaking urgently into the phone. "What do you want?" Patty asked, struggling to keep her voice from breaking. "What we've always wanted," the man said simply. "For people to mind their own business, for grieving mothers to stay grieving, not play detective." Then the line went dead. Patty stood frozen, phone still pressed to her ear, her thoughts racing through everything Detective Martinez had warned her about. The network, the other predators. The encrypted messages. The way these men organized, communicated, and protected each other was like a cult. Dennis might have been behind bars, but clearly he wasn't alone. "This isn't over," she said aloud, her voice shaking. David hung up with the dispatcher. "They're sending a unit now," he said, "but it'll take at least 20 minutes. "We need to leave," Patty said. Her tone had shifted, urgency overriding the exhaustion that had lived in her body for weeks. "Tonight. Now." "They're sending a car." "That's not enough." She stood, moving with purpose through Chloe's room. She began collecting the few things she couldn't bear to lose. The journal, a framed photo from Chloe's nightstand, the stuffed elephant Chloe had slept with as a child, worn soft from years of comfort. "These people murdered my daughter to protect their secrets," she said fiercely. "You think they'll stop at phone calls?" Outside, headlights washed slowly across the front lawn. A car, driving too slowly. Patty's heart skipped. The vehicle coasted past the house, then disappeared behind the curtain of trees. The sound of its engine shut off somewhere down the street. David went to the window, pulling the blinds open just a crack. "Dark sedan. Can't see the plates." Patty's phone rang again. This time she recognized the number. Detective Martinez. "Don't go home tonight," the detective said without preamble. "We intercepted chatter. Someone's watching your house. I'm sending a team to pick you up, now." "How did they find out?" Patty asked, breath catching. "Dennis made a call from the jail," Martinez said grimly. "Used coded language. We think it triggered a contingency." "A contingency?" "These people have protocols, Mrs. Reynolds. When one of them gets arrested, the others go dark or retaliate, and right now, they see you as a loose thread." Out the window, the sedan's door creaked open. Two figures stepped out. Slow, purposeful. They stayed between pools of streetlight, faces hidden in the shadows. David's knuckles whitened on the curtain. "Where's that patrol car?" Almost as if summoned, blue and red lights rounded the corner. A cruiser, moving fast but silent. No sirens. The sedan's doors slammed shut. The engine roared to life. By the time the police reached the driveway, the car was gone. But Patty knew they'd be back. These weren't ordinary criminals. They weren't random predators. They were organized, strategic, vicious. Dennis might be behind bars, but his network was alive and furious. When the officer arrived, a young man named Collins, barely out of the academy, he looked overwhelmed but determined. "Detective Martinez sent me," he said, badge in hand. "We're taking you to a safe location." Patty turned and looked around Chloe's room one last time. She stared at the bed where her daughter had once dreamed, the desk where she'd typed journal entries in secret, the mirror that had hidden the camera, and the monster behind it. "Mom always said the truth would set you free," Patty whispered, clutching Chloe's journal to her chest. "She just didn't mention it might kill you first." The safe house was a nondescript ranch-style home 20 miles outside town. From the street, it looked abandoned. Shutters closed, weeds in the garden. But inside, it was reinforced steel. Cameras in every corner, heavy locks, silent alarms. Detective Martinez was waiting, along with a woman in a gray blazer who introduced herself as Agent Sarah Mills, FBI, Crimes Against Children Unit. The federal involvement made it real in a new way. Heavy, expansive, dangerous. "How many are we talking about?" Patty asked as they sat around a chipped kitchen table. Agent Mills opened a thick file. "So far, we've confirmed at least a dozen men in regular contact with Dennis Kruger over the past 2 years. The network spans 4 states. We've identified a retired cop, 2 high school teachers, a youth pastor, and a man who runs a photography studio for children." Patty's stomach turned. "And the victims?" David asked. "We're still reviewing data from Dennis's drives," Mills said. "But we've already found signs of over 40 potential victims. Some were photographed, others mentioned in chat logs. Chloe's documentation is helping us cross-reference names, girls who might have been too scared to come forward. 40. The word hit like ice. 40 families who had no idea. 40 girls who thought they were alone, who thought what happened to them was their fault. Martinez leaned forward. The men who called you tonight, we believe they're part of what we're calling the inner circle. They coordinate targets, they plan grooming strategies, and when necessary, they eliminate threats. Like Chloe, Patty said. Agent Mills nodded solemnly. Like Chloe. Why me? Patty whispered. Why us? Because Dennis kept records. That's against their rules. He was supposed to wipe everything. He didn't. And when you started digging, it forced him to act. That created a ripple effect. Patty swallowed hard. So what happens now? Agent Mills didn't sugarcoat it. Now we use the ripple to sink the whole operation. We want you to testify before a federal grand jury. Patty's breath caught. Testify? Mills nodded. Help us build airtight cases against every name, every monster. But it also means you'll be a target until we take them all down. David had been quiet, absorbing every word. Now he leaned forward. How long are we talking about? Could be months, Mills said. Maybe longer. These people are methodical. They plan for contingencies. They won't go quietly. Patty looked down at the journal in her hands, at Chloe's small, careful handwriting. She thought about her daughter's voice. Brave, steady, whispering from the past. She had already sacrificed everything. Now it was Patty's turn to carry the weight. Patty sat in the quiet safe house, Chloe's journal open in her lap, the pages heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. Outside, the wind rustled through the tall grass, and the night pressed against the windows like a waiting shadow. She read the entries again, her fingers tracing each loop of Chloe's careful handwriting. These were her daughter's final thoughts, words written not in despair, but with courage, with purpose. Chloe had lived her last weeks in a state of terror, a secret war fought in silence to protect the very person she loved most. Patty thought about that, about the unbearable burden Chloe had carried alone so she wouldn't disrupt the fragile illusion of happiness. I'll do it, she said, her voice a quiet promise that cut through the room. David looked up sharply. Patty, he began. I'll do whatever it takes to stop them, she repeated, firmer this time. Chloe died thinking she had to protect me. I won't let her sacrifice be for nothing. Agent Mills gave a solemn nod. We'll need you to wear a wire if Dennis or his associates attempt contact again. Any phone calls, in-person meetings, even video calls. Anything that might reveal names or operational details. Patty's spine stiffened. You want me to talk to Dennis? Only if he initiates contact, Mills said. Men like him, when they feel cornered, can't help themselves. They want to rewrite the narrative, reshape the truth. He may try to manipulate you into recanting or remembering things differently. The idea of speaking to Dennis again made Patty's stomach twist. The sound of his voice, even in memory, coiled around her like a snake. But if it meant bringing justice to Chloe, to other girls still trapped in similar nightmares, she'd face it. For her daughter's memory, for the other mothers who didn't yet know what danger lived under their roof. Martinez's phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at the screen, her expression darkening. What is it? Mills asked. Dennis's lawyer just filed a motion, Martinez said, voice clipped. He's claiming prosecutorial misconduct. Says we coerced a confession from a grieving widow under duress. Wants the recording tossed as inadmissible. Patty's heart sank. Can they really do that? They can try, Mills said, closing her folder with finality. But the physical evidence backs you up. The hidden camera, the SD cards, the videos, your daughter's journal, the files from Dennis's computer. It all aligns with what he admitted. Patty exhaled shakily, but Mills wasn't finished. There's something else, she said. Something we found in Dennis's search history. He was already moving on, already grooming his next target. Her words struck like a thunderclap. Her name is Lisa Cameron, Mills continued. She lives one county over, works at a grocery store. Recently divorced, has a 15-year-old daughter. Dennis had already connected with her through a dating app. They were planning to meet next week. Patty's mind reeled. While she had been mourning, shattered by grief, Dennis had been hunting again, looking for another family to infiltrate, another girl to shatter. "Does she know?" she asked. "We contacted her this morning. She's cooperating." She was suspicious already, and Dennis seemed too interested in her daughter. "She's shaken, but she's safe." Patty closed her eyes, picturing another mother, another teenage girl walking unknowingly into Dennis's orbit. "How do we stop all of them?" she asked softly. Mills's answer was simple. "One at a time, and we start with Dennis." That night, alone in the safe house bedroom, Patty opened Chloe's journal to the very last page. It was one she hadn't yet been able to face. The handwriting was different, shaky, rushed, full of emotional weight. The date, January 15th. "I know what I have to do now. Not because I want to die, but because I can't live knowing he'll hurt other girls if I don't stop him. Mom will blame herself, and that breaks my heart. But maybe someday she'll understand. Maybe someday she'll find this journal and know that I wasn't giving up. I was fighting back the only way I knew how. If you're reading this, Mom, it means you found the camera. It means you know the truth. Don't let him convince you I was sick or broken. I was your daughter, and I was strong enough to choose sacrifice over surrender. Make him pay. Make them all pay. And know that wherever I am, I'm proud of you for being brave enough to look for the truth. I love you. I'm sorry I couldn't find another way. Love, Chloe. P.S. Check the heating vent behind my bed. I left something there that might help." Patty's breath caught. She set the journal down gently and knelt beside the bed. Her fingers searched along the baseboard until they found the heating vent. The screws had been loosened. She pulled the grate free. Inside was a small digital recorder, sleek, newer than the one hidden behind the mirror. She held it like a sacred object. She pressed play. The audio quality was sharp, clearer than anything they'd retrieved so far. And then she heard it. Dennis's voice. Not talking to her, but on the phone, speaking to others. He talked about Chloe, how she was becoming a liability. He referenced moving on. He spoke of next candidates. Voices on the other end responded, masked in casual tones, joking about who was ripe, who was ready. Her stomach turned. This wasn't just surveillance. It was coordination. Chloe had recorded it all. She'd known exactly what she was doing. The next morning, back in the safe house kitchen, Patty placed the recorder on the table. Agent Mills stared at it like it might explode. "Your daughter recorded Dennis's phone calls?" she asked. Patty nodded. "She was 17, she said, but she was smarter than any of us gave her credit for." Martinez opened her notebook, her pen already scribbling notes. Mills reached for her phone, calling in a tech specialist from the field office. They would need help extracting the files. "Before we listen to this," Mills said, "you need to understand what it could mean. If Chloe recorded Dennis coordinating with other predators, we're looking at conspiracy charges, interstate crimes, potential federal indictments, names and locations of victims we don't even know about yet." "Play it," Patty said, no hesitation. Mills pressed a button. The speaker crackled. A few seconds of static. Then came Chloe's voice, soft and steady. "January 3rd, she said in a whisper. "I think he's planning to meet someone. He's been messaging again. He thinks I'm asleep." Then Dennis's voice took over. Clear, distinct, and utterly damning. December 10th, 2008. The night air had gone still, thick with silence that only seemed to deepen the dread crawling under Patty's skin. She sat in the dim kitchen of the safe house, the recorder Chloe had hidden tucked between her hands like a relic. As the file began to play, a whisper of static gave way to Dennis's voice. Sharp, impatient, more distinct than in any of the previous recordings. "She's getting suspicious," he muttered, unaware that his own steps were being retraced months later by the daughter he tried to silence. "Keeps asking questions. Why I'm always checking on her. Why do I stay in the hallway after I think she's asleep? Another voice cut in, gravelly, older, and cold. Maybe it's time to move on, the man said, his tone so casual it chilled the room. Find a new family. Dennis didn't hesitate. I'm not ready. The mother's perfect, completely trusting, and the girl, she's exactly the type we discussed. Patty's jaw clenched. Every part of her recoiled at the clinical way they described her daughter, as if Chloe were inventory, an asset, not a living, breathing girl. Her fists tightened in her lap, nails biting into her palms. You're getting sloppy, Dennis, the gravelly voice warned. Emotional attachment is dangerous in our line of work. It's not attachment, Dennis shot back. It's an investment. I've spent months setting this up. The surveillance equipment alone is worth nothing if you end up in prison, the man interrupted sharply. Handle the girl, or we'll handle her for you. The file ended with a quiet click, but the silence it left behind rang louder than the recording. Agent Mills straightened in her chair, face taut. That voice, she said. We need to run it through voice recognition, see if it matches anyone in our database. Patty didn't even look up. Her thumb scrolled through the tiny screen. There's more, she said. 23 recordings total. They played the next file. Dennis again, this time in a lower register, more controlled. The Cameron woman took the bait, he said. I'm meeting her next Thursday. A pause, then a question from someone else, off mic, but clearly part of the same conversation. What about your current situation? Nearly resolved, Dennis replied without emotion. The girl won't be a problem much longer. A tremor ran through Patty's limbs. This was dated January 12th, just 3 days before Chloe died. He'd already decided, already planned, already written the ending to a life that wasn't his to control. Across the room, Detective Martinez's phone rang. She stepped away to take the call, but even from a distance, words drifted back, fragments like federal warrant, multi-state operation, and additional units. Agent Mills paused the playback. Mrs. Reynolds, she said gently but firmly, this changes everything. We're not just talking about prosecuting Dennis anymore. We're in RICO territory now. Organized criminal enterprise, spanning state lines. Patty looked at her. How many more girls? We won't know until we finish going through the files, Mills said, exhaling slowly. But based on what we've heard so far, she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Martinez returned, her face pale. That was my captain, she said. Since Dennis's arrest hit the news, 3 more families have come forward. Parents who always suspected something was wrong, but who were too afraid to speak up. Afraid of what? Patty asked, though she already knew. Threats, harassment, just like you've experienced. Martinez's eyes darkened. One family lost their daughter last year. Suicide. That's what the authorities thought. Now, they're not so sure. A fresh wave of nausea rose in Patty's stomach. How many Chloes had there been? How many teenage girls had suffered in silence, buried under guilt and manipulation while monsters like Dennis thrived? She looked down at the recorder, her daughter's final act of defiance. Play the rest, she said. They listened through the night, one recording after another, piecing together timelines, mapping out a network far larger than anyone had imagined. Chloe had been meticulous. She noted names, addresses, license plates, and even times when Dennis left the house or took phone calls. In one audio file, she even whispered her observations out loud, timing when Dennis entered the hallway or used the landline. By sunrise, they had a rough sketch of 16 members spread across 4 states. Among them were school officials, local businessmen, and even a youth counselor. All of them had been in contact with Dennis. How did she even get all this? Mills asked, her voice frayed from fatigue. Patty's voice was soft. Chloe was quiet, observant, always listening. People thought she was shy, but she was watching, She was thinking about girls like her, the ones who'd come next. Mills nodded. She was a hero. Patty swallowed the lump in her throat. She was a child. Mills closed her laptop with a click. We've got enough to move on the network, but we need to do it fast. Once they know we have these recordings, they'll scatter. What about Dennis? Patty asked. Mills's answer was ice. He's going to help us, whether he likes it or not. We've got leverage now, on his friends, his methods, his future plans. He can cooperate and avoid the death penalty, or stay silent and watch everything he built fall apart. Martinez rose from her chair. There's going to be a media storm when this hits. A teenage girl documenting everything. A grieving mother exposing a predator ring. You need to be ready. Patty thought of Chloe's final journal entry. Make them pay. Let the world know. Maybe other mothers would see the signs she had missed. Let them come, she said. Chloe's story deserves to be told. Her phone buzzed on the table. Unknown number. The text chilled her blood. You should have listened. Your brother's going to pay the price. Patty's breath caught. David. Agent Mills was already on the radio, calling for units to check David's apartment. But Patty knew it in her bones. The threat was real. They weren't just trying to scare her. They were following through. The call came at 6:43 a.m. David's voice came over the speaker, steady but raw. I'm okay, he said. But they tried. Mills clicked on the speaker, her hands already flying over her laptop. What happened? Patty asked, her voice thin. 2 men broke into my apartment around midnight, David said. I wasn't there. Spent the night at Katie's like you told me, but they trashed everything, left a message on the wall. What did it say? A beat of silence. Your sister talks too much. Fix it or we will. Agent Mills was already coordinating with local law enforcement, issuing directives with brisk authority. Her voice was steady, but Patty could see the tension behind her eyes, the kind that came from realizing just how quickly a situation could spiral. Dennis's network wasn't retreating. They were regrouping, tightening their ranks, and moving swiftly to eliminate anyone who might expose them. Where are you now? Mills asked into her phone, her tone urgent. At the police station, David replied on speakerphone. They're keeping me here until you figure out next steps. Patty could hear the faint background hum of the precinct. Radios crackling, footsteps echoing on tile, a world that had nothing to do with the horror she was trapped in. A wave of guilt crashed over her. Not the abstract kind, but the cold, sharp kind that sat heavy in her lungs and made it hard to breathe. This wasn't just about her anymore. Her brother was under threat. The people she loved were being hunted simply because they stood beside her. This ends today, she said quietly. Agent Mills looked up from her radio. What do you mean? I want to visit Dennis. I'll wear a wire. I'll get him to talk, to name names, to expose everything. Mills shook her head immediately, her lips tight. Absolutely not. That's not protocol. It's too dangerous. They're already trying to kill my brother. How much more dangerous do you think this can get? Patty, they've made it clear they don't negotiate. They don't make deals. They erase threats. Then we erase them first. Her voice no longer trembled. It rang with quiet conviction, the kind only forged by loss and resolve. Dennis thinks he's the smartest person in the room. His ego won't let him resist the chance to manipulate me again. Let him try. I want him to think he's winning. Detective Martinez, who had been silent for much of the discussion, finally spoke. She's right. Narcissists can't resist a final performance, especially when they believe they still have control. If we're careful, this could work. 3 hours later, Patty sat across from Dennis in the sterile, cold gray visiting room of the county jail. The table between them was scratched, its surface carved with names and dates of those who had sat here before. Some seeking closure, some confrontation. A wire lay hidden beneath her sweater, the tiny microphone taped to her collarbone. In an observation room next door, Martinez and Mills sat hunched over monitors, headphones in place. Every second recorded. Dennis walked in wearing the orange jumpsuit and wrist shackles of a man awaiting trial. But his demeanor hadn't changed. He still carried himself with an air of smug confidence, as if this were just another inconvenience he would eventually outmaneuver. He smiled when he saw her, the same disarming, calculated grin that had fooled her 2 years ago. "Hello, Patty," he said, sliding into the chair. "You look tired." "I haven't been sleeping well," she replied evenly. "Grief will do that," he said with mock sympathy. "Losing a child is the worst thing that can happen to a parent." It took everything in her not to recoil. The way he said it, as if Chloe had simply slipped away instead of being methodically destroyed by the man in front of her, made her want to scream. But she kept her hands folded in her lap, her expression unreadable. "The FBI thinks you're part of a network," she said. "A group that targets families, mothers with daughters." Dennis chuckled softly. "The FBI thinks a lot of things. Doesn't make them true. They have recordings, Dennis. Chloe recorded your calls." For the first time, his mask cracked. His eyes flickered with something darker. Panic, rage, maybe both. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "Clever girl," he said. "Smarter than I gave her credit for. Smart enough to record everything I did to her. Smart enough to get herself killed." He leaned forward. His voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "You want to know what really happened that night? She came at me with a knife, said she was going to cut my throat while you slept. I had to defend myself." Patty's fingers curled into fists. "So, you drugged her?" "They were just sleeping pills. I thought it would calm her down. We could talk, rationally. And when she passed out, you typed her suicide note." Dennis's lips curved into that familiar, sickening smirk. "Prove it." "I don't have to," Patty said, pulling out her phone. She tapped the screen until a photo appeared, Chloe's journal, open to the final entry. "She documented everything, every conversation, every time you told her to keep quiet to protect me." Dennis stared at the photo. He didn't speak for several seconds, his face twisted with conflicting emotions. Finally, he muttered, "Even if that's real, it's still just her word against mine." Along with video footage, audio recordings, and your entire hard drive full of other victims. Dennis sat back in his chair, jaw tight. His voice dropped another octave. "You think this is going to stop me? Stop men like me? You've disrupted one operation, one, but the demand never disappears. There are always more girls, and there are always men ready to find them." "Then help me stop them," Patty said. "Give me names." Dennis laughed, but it sounded less confident now. "Why would I do that?" "Because they've already come for my brother. You think they won't come for you too? If they think you're a liability." For a flicker of a moment, genuine fear crossed his face. "You don't understand," he whispered. "These people, some of them are in law enforcement, politics, medicine. They're powerful. Then help us expose them." Dennis fell, silent. Then, finally, he muttered, "There's a man in Tennessee, James Morrison. He runs a youth program. He handles cleanup. If anyone's going to start tying up loose ends, it's him." Patty's breath caught. Morrison. The name had been in Chloe's recordings. "Who else?" Dennis hesitated, then rattled off 4 more names. Each one met with the quiet fury in Patty's eyes. When the visit ended, she walked out with more than just names. She walked out with confirmation that Dennis's network was crumbling, but she also carried the uneasy feeling that Dennis had told her just enough to serve his own ends. 2 weeks later, the FBI launched simultaneous raids across 4 states. 12 arrests were made on the first day. Dozens of hard drives and encrypted files were seized. Businesses were shuttered. News anchors ran breathless coverage of the unfolding scandal. The headlines were bold. "National Child Exploitation Ring Busted, Thanks to Teen's Secret Recordings." But for Patty, the only headline that mattered was the one she whispered in her mind every morning when she woke up. Chloe fought back. And she won. Massive predator network exposed by teen victims' secret recordings. The headline spread across news outlets nationwide. Chloe's story, her courage, her sacrifice, and her final gift. became a rallying cry for families shattered by predatory abuse. But for Patty, sitting alone in yet another safe house as the investigation continued, the victory felt hollow. Dennis had been right about one thing. There would always be other daughters, other families, men who saw children as objects. Patty couldn't save Chloe, but maybe, just maybe, with what her daughter had left behind, she could help save someone else. The journal lay open on the table beside her, the last page turned upward. Make him pay. Make them all pay. Patty looked out the window. The street was quiet. Normal, suburban. Mothers are getting their children ready for school. Fathers starting their cars. People trusted that the adults in their children's lives were keeping them safe. I'm trying, baby, she whispered. I'm trying. And somewhere, in a house Patty would never see, another mother would notice the signs she had missed. Another daughter would find the strength Chloe had shown. Another predator would be stopped before they could destroy a family. It wouldn't bring Chloe back. Nothing ever could. But it would mean her daughter hadn't died for nothing. The phone rang. Agent Mills. An update on the case. Patty answered before the first ring had even ended. There was still work to do.